But I had really struggled with Immanuel Kant at one time and some of the challenges that he pressed, especially upon epistemology and things like this. And I don't feel like I'd sort of tabled it and just accepted the Catholic truths on faith. And I really feel like with the critical question, kind of going back to that Fehlner, in my own mind, kind of adequately addresses the and well first off, how would you describe the critical question?
My understanding with like the critical question, I remember when I was studying epistemology and just being in the chapel and being like, closing my eyes and being like, wait a minute, like I can't see any of this now. Like, is it still there?
Mm-hmm.
like realizing like all of a sudden very much like I'm in here.
Yeah.
And that's out there. And how do you, and so Father Peter, he was originally sort of inclined to just adopt the neo-scholastic approach, which is that insofar as that's a real problem, like real, connecting with the outside world and the reality of the outside world and the connection of things. Like if you really have a problem with that, it's not so much a philosophical problem as a psychiatric one.
Mm-hmm.
And that the critical question is just, it's a non-starter. It's a pseudo problem. Whereas then under the influence of servant of God, or maybe venerable Leone Veluthe, another conventual Franciscan that he knew in Rome, he saw that there's a point to the critical question. And this gets into, again, to the question of the will and how in the Franciscan school, the intellectual or the faculties of the soul, powers of the soul, memory, intellect, and will are much more entwined, present to one another. And whereas it's much more linear in the Thomistic, it's like you see something that's good and you desire it, and the will is the appetite of the intellect and all these. With the Franciscans, it's like the will is in the intellect and the intellect is in the will. And so whenever you're thinking, the will is also engaged. And so like Scotus in a certain way describes the intellect like a flashlight that the will is directing. And so then the critical question here is the relationship between like objective truth and that freedom, or then to quote, to his treatment in this, when he treats it, he says the critical question has two sort of elements to it. Here it is. It's that the critical, there is a critical question in a true sense of that term, that is a need to make a personal judgment in conscience about truth once encountered is a simple fact once one admits that once one admits the validity of withdrawing from the outer world and entering into the self. So like you could say for an extrovert, the critical question never occurs. Like they're just always out there.
Yeah.
And then the intrinsic link, which this postulates between intellectual speculation and spirituality, that is, or holiness. And so basically like the fact that the search for truth, you have to have skin in the game. You have to be committing yourself to the truth. It can't just remain at the level of mere intellectual theory, but you have to really enter into it with the full of your person. And so I think that's sort of a sense of the critical question there. He says, if you go to the level of pride and ingratitude and expect the world to justify itself before you, he says, in that case, it's just going to dissolve. It's going to dissolve in your fingertips, and that's modern philosophy. But if you're able to enter in with humility and realizing that the light that shines in mine and the light that is in the world, the rationality in the world, both ultimately come from God.
Hmm.
And being able to enter into that, or having that humility to realize that I can only account for reality and for myself if I'm willing to die to myself and move to exist at a higher level. Um, from my understanding, and this is something that there are a couple of things in Father Peter that are deep, and they're hard to sort of get into. I was speaking with Dr. Goff back in May, and he was saying just at that time, like after all this time, he just went a step deeper into what he means by the critical question, and how like the resolution of the critical question is in Marian consecration, is in sort of that allowing her to become your teacher. And this also has to do, it's very biographical as well, because this is what happened to him. He had that crisis between the love of learning and the love of God. And that in 1978, with that experience, like, how do I put these two things together? And Our Lady basically said, by handing both to me.